My name's David Schweikard. In this talk, I'd like to present some ideas, some initial thoughts on competition regarded as joint action. I'll do so by commenting a bit on the opposition that is sometimes seen between the notions of cooperation and competition. Then I'll say something about what I take to be the dominant target of theories of joint action building on collective intentionality. And then I will work towards how such theories, how this theoretical framework can be read or even extended so as to account for competition. I will show how there is no room for competition in such accounts, how there might be room, but what that would entail for the analysis. And I'll illustrate that for some ludic and non-ludic context. I'll end with two questions for our discussion. First, social action in the Weberian sense, where any action that's directed towards another is social, or collective action more generally, can be either cooperative or competitive. And indeed, both cooperative and competitive forms of action or complexes of action can yield specific collective outcomes. It needn't be that all agents in a given scenario do something together, do the same thing, or do something together that yields an outcome they together intend, for instance. It could also be that they compete and that this yields an outcome that is, let's say, beneficial to everyone. You have innovation competition, for instance, that might be structured in that way. Still, in some contexts, cooperation and competition are treated as opposites, such that either you cooperate or you compete. And whenever you do cooperate, you don't do anything that can count as competition. And more importantly, and more interestingly, for our purposes here, whenever you compete with someone, there is no level at which you cooperate. Now, this last notion is the one I want to take issue with in this talk. Theories of joint action, especially those with a focus on collective intentionality, have been tailored to the case of cooperation. Now, my questions here, and I hope to work towards answering at least some of them, are as follows. Which forms of competition, if any, should be viewed as forms of joint action? And do competitors cooperate in any sense or in some specific sense? And how should we account for the intentional structure of competition? I will make some informed guesses and gesture towards, at least gesture towards replying to these questions. Now, first, what's been in the foreground for theories of joint action? I say joint action here as a category that sits between solitary individual action and group action. So where jointly acting agents do something like go for a walk together, paint the house together, or push the car out of the ditch together. They cooperate in doing so in many cases, but the point here is, and that's also neat in this terminology, to inquire whether competitive scenarios can also count as joint action, where in some sense they do something together. Well, maybe. Much theorizing of joint action has relied on some idealized notion of joint action. And here are some of the features of this idealization. So usually we see those who defend views choose a paradigm in which the agents involved pursue the same goal. They intend together to paint the house, let's say. But we don't need to go through all or through examples for any of these features. I think they're pretty obvious, or at least pretty familiar in the way they're presented here. The shared and the individual attitudes of these agents are transparent among them. That seems to be a strong idealization and assumption for some analyses. They stand in symmetrical relationships, or an asymmetrical relationship, at least as regards the joint action in question. Then on the model, or on the idealization, there's no unclarity among them as to what their joint action entails and what each agent's bit requires. Then all contributions are understood as co-realizable. So when we paint the house together, you paint the front, I paint the back, then not only does my painting the back not stand in the way, but together our contributions make it the case that we've painted the house together. Then no conflict, that's an assumption, gets in the way of any joint decision or the performance of the action. And if or whenever conflict arises, so the assumption, the agents are capable of resolving it and they are willing to do so. So there are, and much more could be said about these features of an idealized model of joint action. There are quite a few assumptions that of course, they allow to define the concept of a joint action, but they also might raise the question whether the analyses are applicable to real-world situations. So that's my question, or those are questions I put here. The first is one that points us towards a much-needed non-ideal theory of joint action, and that is, which of these features would a non-ideal conception retain? And then for my purposes here, I want to ask how this model might be used to account for competitive interactions. So we'd have to tamper with some of these elements of the idealization in order to account for competition. And I'd like to take up a few of these. So first, let's look at how there could be no room for competition in these accounts. So accounts of joint action that require or treated as a necessary condition that the attitudes among the agents involved be aligned will not treat competition as a form of joint action. So there are, I want to submit, two ways this attitudinal alignment can be understood, but I think both of them are such that if this element or if this requirement is built into an account of joint action, then this account will not be useful for accounting for competition. Or if that's the true account, then it will exclude competition from phenomena of joint action. So we can be open on that front. Anyway, there's a strong version of, or a strong understanding of attitudinal alignment, and it goes like this: that agents have the same attitudes regarding mode and content. So we each have the same attitude towards our shared goal, our common goal, or the collective end we're pursuing, and there's a complete symmetry and a complete match between what you intend and what I intend. Weak attitudinal alignment, by contrast, doesn't require this strong overlap. It only requires sufficient overlap and absence of conflict. So agents' attitudes sufficiently overlap and do not conflict with each other. So here my point is, and it should be relatively clear from the usual examples here. If you take a form of action or a particular action X that's performed as a collective action with parts X1 and X2, then the idea is that each of them says or intends in the form, we shall do X together by way of me doing X1 and you doing X2, or the other way around. Now, how could there be room for competition? So we have to distinguish, or I'm not going to follow through very much with this distinction, but it seems apt, between prepackaged competition and other forms of action agents can turn into a competition. Now, prepackaged competition are those forms of action that can only, those forms of, let's say, collective action, to find one general term, that can only be performed in the mode of competition. Playing a game of chess, playing a game of tennis, these only come as competitions, I submit. Of course, you can perform the action in a non-competitive way, but there is, let's say, the actual form, or the conceptual core of the form of action is that it's got built-in competition. Other forms of action can be turned, well, individual actions can be turned into joint actions. I can go for a walk on my own, and we can go for a walk together. That seems clear. And that can even be turned into a competition. So we can, I don't know, we can go for a walk and see who, I don't know, rounds the pond first or quicker. That's a distinction I would like to see drawn when we get clearer on the definition of competition. Now, if any form of competition is to be treated as joint action and analyzed in terms of collective intentionality, then the core question becomes whether competitors share attitudes regarding their competitive interaction. So where they share attitudes means that they don't just have the same attitude, but they have the attitude in some sense together. One has an attitude because of and in accordance with the others having that attitude. Now, we can differ at this point whether this only extends to the content or it extends to the mode and potentially constitutes a new subject of the attitude, but that's not where the question takes us. It's meant to take us into the nature of competition, asking whether competitors share attitudes in some such sense. Now, then our question is, can they jointly intend the competition and still each intend that they win and the other loses? So if we're putting the end or the point of competition in terms of winning and losing, then we would have to say that on one level they intend the competition as the cooperators intend the goal of the cooperation, but also that they, now the competitors, each intend that they win and the other loses. And the question is how we can capture this on models that are similar to those we've already seen. Now, take two kinds of context. First, fluidic contexts. Take games and competitive sports. Here, clearly, each player or competitor intends to win, right? So we should assume that for at least the standard form of playing a game or of competing in some sports contest. Take chess, take tennis, take whatever example you find appropriate. And they can, in principle, be said to so intend by abiding by the rules of the game. Now, there is, of course, some room for disagreement here, whether intending to abide by the rules of the game is really part of the competitor's mindset. But let's just assume that this will be so. Some games are very strict. Chess, for instance, is very strict in that you can't not play by the rules of the game, because then you wouldn't be playing. You can't move the rook in any other way than specified. So, for instance, and so that is a rather strict context. Whereas in other sports, take soccer, or as it should be called, football, it's that fouls are not strictly part of the game. If you look at the rule book, but they're part of the game if you look at the practice. So how could this be joint action instead of just rule-governed interaction without shared attitudes? So here I want to say it is joint action if the agents jointly intend that they play and compete together. So they can jointly intend, or they can agree to play. They can agree to play by certain rules for a certain time at a certain place in a certain, let's say, setup of rules. So there are many specifications a game can have and can be given that may be read as amounting to a joint intention. And I would say this shouldn't be rare, as some form of joint intention, commitment, or consent underlies the common acceptances of the rules of the game. But the question arises, how can the competitors intend to play and to win? How can they intend to play? How can they partake in the joint intention to play with the other and to win that game? Aren't these intentions contradictory? And here, my suggestion would be to say there's no contradiction if it's indeed plausible that agents first jointly intend the interaction, had that, and that they each intend to contribute, even though it's indeterminate whether their contribution amounts to winning. Now, what they intend in order to perform the joint action is on this reading of the second clause, or on the understanding I want to give the second clause, not that they win, but that they contribute. And of course, they will have to try to win, but they can't intend to win. So here, that's a crucial point. To non-ludic context outside games and sports competition, it's typically that competition is observed on markets with individuals or collectives, with organizations or corporations as the relevant agents. On one level, insofar as those markets in question are rule governed, agents' commitment to these rules can be understood as shared. So each commits, and these commitments are interlocked in some way. Well, this would need to be spelled out. The authority of the respective normative framework may even be held to depend on intentional compliance. That depends, of course, on the exact context. But with markets, it's very often said that the rules of the market are determined either from the outside or from the inside, from those who participate in market interaction. But the individual intention to win, or as in to win the competition, has priority for each agent. It's not about playing or a fair game in those contexts. It's about winning. It's not about playing. These are non-ludic contexts. That's what I want to stress here. And this makes for a different relation between each agent's attitude towards the other's pursuit of their goal. So where we, in ludic context, we may be able to say they jointly intend to play the game or to engage in this particular form of competition, we have a weaker attitude, still one of commitment and acceptance potentially in non-ludic contexts, but it's certainly a weaker attitude because the priority there would be the individual intention to win. So in games like chess, or in team sports, we may have it as a crucial element that there is equal opportunity, so to say, or a formal equality at the outset. So there is, given the rules of those games, a certain symmetry that makes for an equal starting position. And this is accepted, and this is part of the game. Whereas and it's re-established for every instance, for every iteration of those games. In non-ludic context, what the individuals seek is asymmetry. They really seek to win out, even though it's prohibited, or there are obstacles to dominating a market, to dominating a competition, let's say economic competition. It's still plausibly or arguably the intention of agents in those contexts. So that's what I would like to suggest. And to the discussion session in August, I would like to propose and to elaborate on the question, what exactly is the intentional structure of a competitive joint action, and what are the limits to the commonalities between ludic and non-ludic contexts of competition. Thank you very much.